So it looks like everyone and their mother has their review of Spider-Man No Way Home up at this point. But you know what? We like to take our time here at the Vanilla Phantom channel. We like to sit and have a little think before we make a review. We like to digest it a little bit. You know, let it settle like. So up front, as the thumbnail of the video shows, this is a full spoilers review and discussion video for Spider-Man No Way Home. So I caught this film about 2 weeks ago, and I really liked it. It's got a few issues, but it's a massive step up from No Way Home, and it feels like a proper Spider-Man film. For me, No Way Home did a lot of the things I wanted it to do. It actually addressed and fixed some of the long-standing problems I had with MCU Spider-Man, and on its own, it's a really enjoyable Spider-Man film that has a lot of heart to it. It feels really sincere. This film does more to actually flesh out Peter and his supporting characters. MJ and Ned are actually given some real problems to deal with in this one. Their lives are impacted as a result of being associated with Spider-Man. It has proper stakes, and there are some impactful changes that have come out of this that Peter Parker will have to deal with in his own future films. With No Way Home, they're really giving Spider-Man and Peter some problems that he has to overcome and deal with, and because of this is the most like Spider-Man Tom Holland has felt for me since Homecoming. We're seeing Peter handle issues on his own. He's solving problems with his intellect. He's going against Doctor Strange's plans because he believes he's wrong in what he's doing. We're seeing Peter make decisions and stand on his own 2 feet. He feels more like his own man in this film than he has in his own films previously. He's got more agency to him. Seeing Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield back in their roles is surreal to say the least, and seeing them all together is something I never would have thought was even possible. There's this one scene at the end where all 3 Spider-Man jump into action together, and I thought to myself then, they actually did it. It hit me then, I'm watching a film with 3 different versions of Spider-Man all together. Some of my favourite scenes in this film were just seeing the 3 different versions of Spider-Man talking and interacting with each other. But the other Spider-Man don't overshadow Holland either. It's still very much Holland's film. Marvel are actually giving Holland some proper emotional scenes to work with in this one, and he's more than up to handling them. Holland can do a lot more than just the funny, goofy stuff that they usually have him do, which is odd to me, man, because every time I see Holland do this stuff, he really pulls it off. I just want to see Marvel do more with him. There's some pretty choppy CGI, which I think really lets the film down in places, and in some parts you can really tell that not all these actors were on set together. In the case of Lizard and Sandman, it's more obvious. The characters don't really put in an appearance in their human forms, but all in all it feels like a really sincere Spider-Man film. It wears its heart on its sleeve and treats the returning heroes and villains with respect. But man, the standout MVP of this film really has to go to Andrew Garfield though. Garfield shows up to play in this one. Some of the hardest hitting moments in the film come from Garfield. He's going all out here, and he feels 100% like Spider-Man. One of my biggest problems I had with the Amazing Spider-Man films was how Garfield's Spider-Man was written. He was too much the cool kid, but here he comes across exactly like the Peter Parker Spider-Man from the comics. The way he acts as Peter, the way he speaks and how he carries himself. You get this real sense of tragedy coming off the guy. It's really heartbreaking, and Garfield totally sells you on it. You really believe that this guy has been dealing with the loss of Gwen all these years that we haven't seen him, and he's never managed to get over it. It's a strong reminder of how totally underserved this guy was in his own films. Garfield doesn't miss a beat with any of it. It's like he never stopped playing Spider-Man. When he lands that save with MJ at the end in the 3rd act, the expression on his face is actually heartbreaking. The second I saw that scene, I was like, I want this guy to get another Spider-Man film. I want to explore this version of Spider-Man more. We're seeing an older Maguire in this film, and his Peter Parker reflects that. He seems a little different from how I remember him. He's wiser now, more confident in himself. He's not the kid you remember from his own films anymore. This guy has grown up, he's matured into the role as Spider-Man, and it's great to see him back. This was exactly the way I wanted this film to deal with these characters, showing how they've grown and changed in the time since last we saw them, in obvious ways and also in subtle ways too. Seeing how Garfield's Peter looks at how Peter is with MJ tells you so much about him, or how Maguire's Spider-Man is quicker on the draw than Garfield, because he's just been doing this longer. It's my own personal preference, but I would have liked to have seen a little bit more backstory from Garfield and Maguire's Spider-Man to fill in what they've been up to in the last few years since we last saw them. Something from them mentioning that they'd fought other villains outside of the ones that we got to see them fight in their own films. Particularly in the case of Maguire's Spider-Man, I really wanted to know what he'd been up to since the events of Spider-Man 3. We do find out that he's still with MJ and that they're making it work, but still, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more exploration here. One thing I was so happy about with this film was that they don't ever try and make light of the villains from the other Spider-Man franchises. One of the things that I was never fond of in some of the other MCU films was how the villains are played off as a joke sometimes. You get the heroes just making jokes at the expense of the villains, and that for me always cuts away whatever menace the villains have in these films. But here you can tell that Marvel are aware how well loved these particular characters are. A lot of respect is given to Molina's Doc Ock in this film. The script doesn't just totally disregard his arc from Raimi's Spider-Man 2 either. either. Melina Zoc was always a tragic character, and the film shows this to you in some of the quieter scenes. Melina doesn't miss a beat here. He's every bit the threat he was in his own film, and Melina is stealing every scene he's in this movie. Marvel really have that de-aging tech down at this point, because I never would have guessed that Melina or Dafoe were de-aged. Strange feels really off to me in this film, almost like a totally different character. He's not really like what he was in Endgame or even in his own movie. At some points I was getting real bad guy vibes off him. Actually, there's 1 or 2 times in this film where Strange delivers some lines that actually make him sound like an outright villain. He's written as kind of uncaring. I don't really buy that Doctor Strange would be fine with just sending these villains back to their own universe, where they'll meet certain death without him at least trying to find a better option. At one point I was actually sure this was the evil version of Doctor Strange from the What If show. The setup for this film has Peter asking Doctor Strange to put his identity back in the box with a magic spell. Something goes wrong, the spell goes bad, and a bunch of other Spider-Man villains are pulled into the MCU. It's a solid premise for a story, but where that really goes off the rails for me was in how the spell actually goes wrong. Peter just won't stop changing the spell while Strange is casting it, which causes the whole thing to go sideways. And again, this is a case where I think they're trying to be funny with Peter Parker in this scene, with him not fully thinking through what he wants. But when you stop to think that Aunt May dies as a direct result of this spell going wrong, it's all just because Peter and Doctor Strange didn't have a 5-minute chat to kind of hash out the parameters of what the spell should be beforehand. You're kind of making Peter look bad here. In fact, you're kind of making both Strange and Peter look really bad. If this spell has to go bad, then have it be for a reason outside of their control, not for something as minor as Peter couldn't make up his mind as to what he wanted, or Doctor Strange didn't think to ask Peter a few questions first. In a lot of ways, I think it actually would have worked out better if it was the evil Doctor Strange from What If. For me, the Aunt May death scene wasn't really as impactful as it was for other people. And don't get me wrong, it's a really well done scene. Tomei really sells you on it. But that's kind of the problem I have with it too. We're only getting some meaningful scenes with her and Peter now in this film. It lacks the emotional gut punch that Aunt May's death scene had in Spider-Man PS4. That game did a really nice job of establishing Peter and Aunt May's relationship. My problem with it mainly goes back to Marvel not really having done much in these films to really grow the supporting characters out more. I can't really remember any of Peter's interactions with Aunt May, or to be honest, with any of his own immediate supporting cast being particularly deep. Mostly they're just played for laughs. I like the casting of Marissa Tomei as Aunt May, but they haven't really done much with her outside of the joke that she's Peter's hot aunt. I mean, most of the scenes we see her in are with Happy Hogan and they're just played for laughs. We've never really seen her in a bad place after Uncle Ben died. After she found out that Peter was Spider-Man, it didn't really seem to impact her life that much. She was pretty supportive of the whole thing. She didn't stay up nights worried in case he wouldn't come home or anything like that. She found out he was Spider-Man and then nothing. She was just pretty cool about the whole thing. It feels really rushed setting up Aunt May in a kind of de facto Uncle Ben role in this film. While I like seeing Aunt May actually calling Peter out on some of his actions in this film, the MCU Spider-Man films needed a lot more interaction between May and Peter. We're finally getting a bit more of that here, only to have it cut short with May getting killed off. In my head, when I think of this version of Aunt May compared with Rosemary Harris's Aunt May from the Raimi films, you actually believe she had a strong relationship with Peter. You could tell that Peter and Aunt May cared for each other. You got to see her grieving the loss of Uncle Ben. You got to see her struggle after it. The scenes where Aunt May forces Peter to take money from her on his birthday in Spider-Man 2, or when she gets turned down for a loan at the bank, all serve to round out Aunt May as a character you really felt something for. She felt like a real human being. If I were to think of that version of Aunt May dying, it's way more impactful. It actually hits way harder because you're attached to that version of May. But here, Aunt May's death scene doesn't really resonate with me because they've never really done anything to round her out as a character, or round out her relationship with Peter. I mean, to an extent, I think you could kind of have put Ned or Mary Jane or Betty Brandt in the same death scene and it would have impacted me just the same. And this all kind of goes back to a bigger problem that I've seen with some of the writing in the Marvel movies. Sometimes I think the writers are more concerned with making the audience laugh with these characters than they are with giving the characters proper development or emotional moments together. For me, the death of Yinsen in Iron Man was way more impactful. It's this really memorable, emotional scene. I think this was actually the best Iron Man Robert Downey Jr. scene. Tony's expression here, he actually looks like Yinsen dying actually broke something in him. This scene really stuck with you. Yinsen and Tony built a relationship while they were in that cave. They had conversations, they worked together, they grew to respect each other. So it really hit when Yinsen was never planning to get out alive. There was more relationship growth for these characters in the 20 minutes they had together on screen in Iron Man 1 than there was with Aunt May and Peter in all 3 of his solo films. And that's not to say these kinds of scenes are totally absent from the more recent Marvel films. They're not. I just want to see more of them. I just think it's a shame that Marvel doesn't really lean into the more emotional, impactful stuff with their characters. Too often they go for the easy joke. One of the biggest parts of the Spider-Man comics that the writers really focused on was Peter's relationships with his friends and with his family. The comics always had him dealing with some drama in his personal life. These films have never really put any emphasis on that. Going back to what I said earlier, Peter's interactions with the supporting characters are mostly played for laughs. There's never really much weight to their conversations. Ned will usually say something funny or MJ will make a quippy remark, but we never really get to know these characters. Raimi sets up Mary Jane to have had a pretty tough home life in his films. She's an aspiring model and she's trying to make her own way in the world. Harry has a troubled relationship with Norman that makes him feel like he's never good enough. There's depth there. But with Ned and MJ, we don't really know anything about them. In Far From Home, Ned dates Betty Brandt and the whole thing is just played for laughs. We don't learn anything about Ned, we don't learn anything about Betty, and at the end they just break up, and they're both just fine with it. Ned and the other characters don't feel like three-dimensional characters. They feel like comedy relief characters that show up, say a few lines, and then go off screen again. So it's nice in this film to actually see both Ned and Mary Jane actually face some problems. You get to see them show emotion. You get to see them deal with a problem. You get to see Mary Jane hold down a job and deal with an asshole boss. You see both her and Ned dealing with not getting into the school they wanted. It's not much, but it's a start. I hope they actually pick this thread up more in the next few movies. And don't do that, man. Don't have Ned Leeds just pulling off magic by accident that Doctor Strange had a hard time doing in his first film. Uncle Ben has never been a character in these films. I think that's a pretty big deal and something I'm really not a fan of. Peter's relationship with Uncle Ben doesn't look to have informed his development into Spider-Man at all. We've actually seen Peter mourn Tony Stark more than Uncle Ben in these movies. Now in this film it looks like Aunt May dying will be the motivating factor for Peter as Spider-Man, and maybe that was what was missing from this version of Spider-Man all this time. The tragic loss of a parental figure to kind of spurn this version of Spider-Man on, to give him that sense of responsibility. And for me, that puts a really big question mark over what was Peter's relationship to Uncle Ben in this universe. Did Peter even know this guy? Did he get killed by a robber that Peter didn't stop? That's a really important part of Spider-Man's origin story. It just feels wrong having Aunt May die and pretty much just take Ben's place. It's kind of like if only one of Bruce Wayne's parents died in Crime Alley. It feels like because Aunt May only died in this film, Peter's origin story is only now complete after 6 films and he can be the classic version of Spider-Man. I mean, it's better late than never, but it just doesn't really feel like this was planned out at all. But outside of all this stuff, there were so many great character moments and scenes in this film. Man, Willem Dafoe in this movie. This dude absolutely kills it. There's this one scene about halfway through, while Peter is working to rehabilitate and cure the villains, and his spider sense just goes off. It's this great scene. You can really feel the tension building the whole time. Peter knows that something is seriously wrong, but he can't zero in on exactly what it is, and then bang, he just pins Norman's hand to the wall. He can just sense that the guy is about to do something terrible. And this is it. The one thing that the majority of the MCU villains have been missing. Actual menace. There's no jokes at the Goblin's expense here. This guy is a legitimate threat and nobody is not taking that seriously in this film. They really build up Dafoe's Goblin as this crazy psychopath. He's even more psychotic here than he was in the Raimi films. At one point he's getting absolutely pummeled by Peter and he won't stop laughing. This is it, man. This is how you handle villains. You build them up when you actually make the audience uneasy with how evil and twisted they are. Some of the things that I liked the most about this film were just some of the smaller scenes, like Ock looking at Peter's suit and being able to identify it as nanotech, or when Ock says his "the power of the sun in the palm of my hand" line when looking at one of Tony's arc reactors, because Ock would be impressed by that. It's basically what he was trying to make. The villains from different universes talking and working together, Doc Ock stepping in to stop Electro feels totally like something he would do. This stuff I loved. One thing that I really liked was how they handled Electro in this film. I know a lot of people online have said that he's playing the same version of Electro from The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and he's like a totally different character now, but I'm fine with that. I wasn't a fan of his characterization or his design in TASM 2, and I always like when a talented actor gets a second chance at a character with a better script. It doesn't feel like they're redoing the characters so much as it feels like they're fixing a broken one, and to be fair, they acknowledge the changes they've made to him. They turned Electro from the goofball character he was in Amazing Spider-Man 2, with a silly design, into a version of the character that's just way more likable with a way better design that actually pays homage to the comics. Peter's decision to reject Doctor Strange's plan is something the MCU version of Spider-Man needed to do. I love Spider-Man's scenes in Civil War, but one of the things I didn't really like was when Spider-Man meets Captain America for the first time, and Cap asks him, "What did Tony tell you about me?" And Peter just replies, "Tony said you're wrong, but you think you're right." It's like he was just blindly following Iron Man on whatever he said. Like a character like Spider-Man, who has a secret identity, wouldn't have an opinion on registering his identity with the government. He didn't have any thoughts on the issue of registration. He was just going along with what Iron Man said because he looked up to him. It makes sense that a kid like Peter would look up to the older heroes and follow their lead, but only to a certain extent. At some point he has to come out from under their shadow and stand on his own 2 feet and say no and become his own man, his own hero. Maguire's Spider-Man stepping in at the last second to save Norman from being impaled by his own glider is another great scene. I just like that he doesn't say anything, he just looks at Hollins Parker. I was expecting Peter to pull back at the last second, but no, he was 100% going in for the kill. But the scene that really stuck with me the most was when all 3 Spider-Men were together on the roof talking about the people that they had lost and how that had shaped them as heroes. This scene is the real standout for me. Maguire and Garfield are here together, both giving their perspectives to a grieving Peter Parker. It's just really powerful. It means so much more here because we've actually seen these guys experience all this tragedy in their own worlds. We've seen it in their own films. There's just this weight to it because of that. The CGI is kind of all over the place in this film. The scenes with Doctor Strange and Spider-Man fighting are fine, but it starts to get really ropey in the third act. Like to the extent I wasn't able to tell which version of Spider-Man I was looking at. The VFX artists were obviously really rushed getting this one over the line, but it honestly feels like they could have used an extra few months just to polish everything up. And this problem with the CGI is kind of becoming more and more of an issue with the Marvel movies. They're just rushing these things out far too early. The CGI is textureless for some of the shots in this movie. It almost looks like a cartoon, and it just has this effect of pulling you out of the film. After seeing No Way Home, I went back and looked at some of the older films with Maguire and Garfield, and damn man, the CGI in those films still holds up. You look at the CGI in particular for the Amazing Spider-Man films and it totally blows the CGI in this film out of the water. And man, with a budget of 200 million, there really isn't an excuse for that. The way Spider-Man moves when he swings in the Raimi films, there's a weight to it, and that's just not here in some of the action sequences. I'm a guy who's always going to prefer real wire work and practical effects and stunts over CGI, and it's a real shame that Marvel have moved away from that entirely in some of their films. One thing I really appreciated about the Amazing Spider-Man films was that they actually did real web swinging for some of the action scenes. They had a stuntman doing that, but here, pretty much every time Spider-Man jumps into action, it's a hard cut into some ropey CGI. Marvel must have been listening to all the complaints the fans had with MCU Spidey. No more advanced suits, no more lack of problems, no more Iron Man characters hanging around to provide assistance, and in the end Peter is left with nothing in this dingy apartment. Peter is absolutely at his lowest point in the entire franchise. It actually makes you feel really bad for the guy. It's a great starting point for the next series of Spider-Man films, but I want to see Spider-Man keep his identity even from Mary Jane and Ned for at least one film. I really hope they won't just undo the ending of this film and have Peter just tell MJ and Ned he's Spider-Man straight away. This is a second chance to put right some of the mistakes that were made the first time round. I want to see Peter actually have to lead a double life, with an emphasis on keeping his identity a secret from the people closest to him. The secret identity stuff has been pretty much glossed over for a lot of the characters in the MCU. Outside of Daredevil, no character has to lead a double life. The secret identity stuff doesn't need to be there for every character, but for Spider-Man it's such an important part of who he is. So I want to see Marvel actually lean into this aspect of the character. Mary Jane figured out Peter Parker's identity in the second film, and Ned pretty much knew right from the very first film. So we never really got a film exploring what it meant for Peter Parker to actually keep his identity secret from those who are closest to him. Since this film has come out, a few rumours have been going around that Garfield is wanting to continue on in the role and Marvel are interested in giving him another project. That's something Marvel should absolutely be prioritising. I actually think there is plenty of room for multiple Spider-Men. I'm not one of those people who think you should just have one iteration of a character on TV or in the movies. After Far From Home, I was pretty worried about the direction that Marvel were taking Spider-Man in, but this film goes a long way towards getting me back interested in the MCU iteration of Spider-Man again. The ending does feel like a sincere attempt on Marvel's side to put the character in a place that's closer to the comic book version, with opportunities for Garfield and Maguire to come back as their versions of Spider-Man and a back-to-basics approach for Holland's Spider-Man going forward. I'm genuinely excited to see what the future has in store for Spider-Man.